Everybody, Ms. Al Khair. Welcome to the American University in Cairo's Tahrir campus. On behalf of our director, Dr. Ibrahim Awad, I would like to invite you all to our first lecture series of the 2019-2020 academic year on behalf of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. I'm honored to introduce a very good friend of the center, Dr. Kelsey Norman. Dr. Kelsey Norman is a fellow for the Middle East at Rice University's Baker Institute. Her research focuses on women's rights, human rights, and refugees in the Middle East and North Africa. Her other research interests include comparative political institutions, international relations, immigration, citizenship, gender, and Middle East and North African politics. Her current book project, Reluctant Reception, Understanding Host State Migration and Refugee Policies in the Middle East and North Africa, is based on 3 years of fieldwork in Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey. The book project is adapted from her doctoral dissertation, which was chosen for the Best Dissertation Award by the Migration and Citizenship section of the American Political Science Association. We welcome Dr. Kelsey very warmly here tonight for our lecture. She'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. Thank you all for attending.
Hello, Ms. Al Khair. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming out. I know traffic is probably not great at this time, so thank you for making it. So the project I'm presenting tonight is related to the book project, which is also based on this fieldwork I did for my doctoral dissertation. So I'm going to be talking primarily about Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey, and even more focusing on Morocco and Turkey specifically. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions sort of about the larger project. So the title of the talk tonight is Inclusion, Exclusion, or Indifference, Host State Responses to Migration and Refugees. So when we think about, maybe not we, but when the international sort of community thinks about migration, I think, and refugees specifically, I think sort of images like this come to mind, right? So very dangerous boat or maybe land journeys, as well as individuals trying to reach primarily countries in Europe and maybe North America. And if we think about this particular image, which was taken in 2015 at sort of the height of Europe's quote-unquote refugee crisis, you know, this sort of urgency is depicted. And again, it's usually about journeys going towards these Western countries. But if we think about 2015 and we think about Syrian refugees in particular, it was actually the minority of individuals who were trying or who actually did reach Europe. So if you can see, I know it's a little bit not clear, but if you can see just sort of the size of the green dots, those are the number of asylum applications that were filed in European countries between January 2015 and June 2016, so more than a year at sort of that crisis point. And if we compare that with the circles that are red, so the number of Syrians residing in 2016 in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt, we can see that these circles are much larger, right? So it was predominantly neighboring countries that were hosting Syrian refugees, not countries in Europe. And this is beyond just sort of the Syrian refugee crisis. This is indicative of a broader phenomenon whereby migration, and even in academia, migration and refugee literature tends to focus on countries of the global north as receiving countries. So if we look at the graph on the left, this is the stock of international migrants worldwide in 2015. So you can see the white portion of the circle, that is the number of individuals, international migrants, residing in countries of the global north. It's about 57%. And if you look at countries, if you look at the purple section of the graph, that is the number of individuals residing in the global south. So it is the majority that reside in the global north, but only just slightly. So it's nearly half of international migrants residing in countries of the global south. So south to south migration. And if we think about global refugees, this is even more pronounced. So in the graph to the right, you can see the purple section of the graph is the number of individuals, number of refugees residing in countries of the global south. So 86.3% in 2015, probably even greater now, compared to just 13.7% in countries of the global north. But you wouldn't necessarily know this from the way that migration and refugees in particular are depicted in international media and spoken about by government officials and even written about by researchers as well as in academia. So my research question in this sort of broader project is so focusing on one particular Global South region, how do Middle East and North African host states strategically manage their migrant and refugee populations? So when countries start to experience increased settlement of migrants and refugees, how do they react? How do these host governments develop policies or not towards these populations? And I break this larger question down into sort of 3 sections. So the first is, how do states respond to new patterns of settlement? So what does an initial response look like? And what are the options that states have for responding to migrants and refugees? Second, what causes a response to change over time? Why might a state change its policy towards migrants and refugees? And then third, what are the consequences of a chosen policy by a state for individual migrants and refugees? So for tonight's presentation, I'll be focusing primarily on these sort of first 2 and even maybe mostly on the middle one, but I'm happy to talk more about the third component. What do policies look like for migrants and refugees? How are they experienced by them in the Q&A? So just to give you sort of an outline of where this is going. First, I'll talk about my argument, and I'll talk about this idea that I call strategic indifference. I'll talk about the methods that I used in the research. I'll draw on some case study evidence to talk about these different policy options. And then I'll talk very briefly about some of the implications for migrants and refugees and draw some conclusions. So hopefully we have time for all that. Okay, so what necessitates this question? Why do we know sort of less, at least in academia, why do we know less about how countries in the Global South respond to migrants and refugees than we know about the Global North, given that there's sort of equal numbers of migrants residing in both regions? I think one thing is that there's this assumption of impermanence of migrants or refugees residing in countries of the Global South. So either migrants are thought to be just transiting through countries of the Global South en route to other locations, or refugees are thought to only reside in these countries, neighboring countries, for example, until a situation has changed and they can go back home. But increasingly, we see sort of protracted refugee situations where it's not always the case that refugees feel comfortable returning to their home country, at least not in the immediate term. And with focusing on refugees in particular, there's been more of an emphasis in migration and refugee studies on, this is starting to change, but previously anyway, there was more of a focus on camps as sites of refugee settlement. So in a camp situation, it might be the case that a refugee might not have much interaction with host country nationals or with host country authorities or government figures. But in an urban situation, which is actually where the majority of refugees live globally now, they are very likely to have a lot of interaction with host country nationals and maybe even with host country authorities. And then third, there's this sort of implicit assumption in this literature that Global South, that host states in the Global South just don't really have the capacity to engage with migrants or refugees, so we shouldn't really expect much from them. And just as sort of 2 examples from 2 prominent migration scholars, this is a quote from Jim Hollyfield, who says, "In Africa and the Middle East, which have high numbers of migrants and refugees, there is a great deal of instability, and states are fluid, with little institutional or legal capacity for dealing with international migration." So again, this emphasis on lack of capacity or lack of ability for states to do much in terms of responding. And then this is a quote from Alexander Betts, another prominent refugee scholar, who says, "With relatively porous borders, limited capacity to deport, and a clearly defined legal obligation not to forcibly return refugees to their countries of origin if they face persecution, these neighboring states have little choice but to host refugees." So again, this sort of emphasis on states as lacking agency and lacking choice and not having the ability to react to migrants and refugees staying for sort of short to medium term on their territory. And so what I argue in this work is that instead of just thinking about sort of the traditional options that states might have for responding to migrants and refugees, we can think about this sort of third option that I'm calling indifference or strategic indifference. And basically what this means is that a host state might not engage directly with migrants or refugees. It might be not such a visible response as you see in other locations, but there's this indirect state engagement that's going on because host states are interacting with INGOs, so international non-governmental organizations, domestic NGOs, international migration organizations that are doing sort of the direct engagement on the state's behalf. So if a state proclaims itself as sort of strategically indifferent, it necessitates that these other actors step in and provide services for migrants and refugees. And by incorporating this option, thinking about it as a response, as sort of a non-response response, it allows us to understand how things like diplomatic and economic concerns are actually driving policy decisions by these states at least as much as the capacity of the host state. And I'll explain this more as we go forward. And then another important component is that indifference, this sort of indirect engagement, allows for de facto economic and social integration of refugees and migrants into these sort of urban environments. So if we think about indifference and place it with sort of other policy options that are available to host states, I come up with this, this sort of three-pronged option, or three different types of options that states have. So first of all, I should quickly define what I mean by engagement. So I think about engagement, state engagement, as any interaction, whether it's direct or indirect, that a state has with migrants and refugees residing on its territory. And so if we think about a liberal engagement, this is probably most similar to sort of what we think about in the academic literature on migration as integration. So actively attempting to bring migrants and refugees into a host state. So through things like education programs or training programs, so actively trying to bring migrants and refugees into national systems. And the opposite of this would be a repressive approach that aims to actively exclude migrants and refugees from the national system, whether it's through policing, maybe detention, maybe even deportation. And then third, there's this indifferent option. And again, this is indirect engagement. So a state is not engaging directly with migrants and refugees, but this engagement is mediated by these mediated by actors like NGOs, INGOs, international migration bodies, and it allows for de facto integration, economic and social integration into the host state. So to help sort of conceptualize this a bit better, I place these three different options, so the purple are the three different policy options, on these two axes. So on the x-axis is the goal of the policy. Is it more to include migrants or refugees into the national system, or is it mostly to exclude them? And then if we think about the y-axis, this is the relative level of state expenditure that's required to enact the policy. So relatively low or relatively high. So both a repressive and liberal policy require quite a lot of state resources. So a liberal policy, if you're going to implement things like educational programs or training programs, this requires a lot on the part of the state. A repressive policy also requires a lot in terms of active policing measures or detention facilities or deporting individuals. An indifferent approach requires relatively little in terms of state resource expenditure, and its goal is neither to entirely include, but neither to entirely exclude either migrants or refugees from the national system. So kind of keeping this in mind, I'll move on to my cases and talk about how these different policy options map onto empirical reality. So the three cases I've selected are Morocco, on the far left, Egypt, and Turkey, which, as you can see from this map, sort of cover these important migratory routes leading up towards Europe. But in reality, especially since the 1990s and going forward, it's become increasingly difficult to actually fulfill those journeys, to complete those journeys up towards Europe. So this is a photo I took of the border crossing between Morocco and one of the two Spanish enclaves on sort of the northern coast of Morocco, Ceuta. So as you can see, this is a heavily fortified border. There's multiple layers of walls. There's spotlights. There's all sorts of other mechanisms to prevent people from crossing irregularly into Spain. And this is indicative of a larger phenomenon, which includes things like physical barriers, but also includes all sorts of policies that Europe has enacted over the past 3 decades with countries of its periphery in order to control migration towards Europe. So the resulting factor is that for many individuals, it's impossible to complete that journey, and countries like Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey end up sort of being de facto receiving countries for migrants and refugees. So the data collection for this project basically involved fieldwork carried out off and on over about 3 years. So in total, about 25 months. And I'm drawing on 153 semi-structured interviews that I conducted in these 3 countries, so in Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey. And then I used qualitative data analysis software to help me analyze and code this collective interview data. I spoke with both elites, including government officials, individuals at international migration bodies like the UNHCR and IOM and some other UN agencies, international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, as well as individual migrants and refugees. So sort of anyone I could speak to that is involved, whether directly or tangentially, in this sort of migration and refugee protection sector. And what I'm going to talk about now is this trajectory. So I'm going to begin with this earlier period. So when you start seeing this border externalization process from Europe and the impact it has on countries of its periphery, I argue that you see sort of an indifferent response from these 3 countries. So in Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey, in this earlier period, the 1990s and 2000s, you see indifference at play. And then, as we move forward, especially in this time period when I was conducting interviews, there were some interesting changes going on. So I'm going to talk in particular, I guess I'll show this a bit later. I'm going to talk in particular about Morocco and Turkey, who both in 2013 moved towards a more liberal framework. And I'll talk more about what that means. But first, I'll talk about this earlier period and try to sort of describe in a more thorough sense what indifference means at play. So Egypt, beginning in the 1990s and 2000s. When we think about Egypt as a receiving country, of course, the numbers are somewhat small in comparison to Egyptian emigrants, right? So there's somewhere between 8 and 9 million Egyptians residing abroad, which is certainly more the prerogative of the Egyptian government in comparison to the number of migrants and refugees residing here. But it doesn't mean that they go unnoticed. So as someone from the Ministry of the Interior told me, of course we know about them being migrants and refugees. We let them stay, even those who come illegally. So why? Why is that the case? Why does Egypt permit them to remain? And I look at some of the benefits that Egypt might consider when thinking about hosting migrants and refugees. So the first is international funding. So sometimes international funding that's meant to be directed towards migrants and refugees in particular, will also tangentially benefit Egyptian citizens. So if we're going to help recapacitate a school that allows refugees to enroll, that money will also benefit Egyptian nationals who are attending that school, just as an example. Migrants and refugees are participating in the informal economy, and we can talk more, actually I will talk more a bit about some of those sectors that they are participating in. And it was pointed out to me that in addition, individuals who can't necessarily get by participating in the informal economy or through assistance from an international organization might also receive help from friends and family living abroad. So remittances that are being received here in Cairo, and that money is being spent locally. So these are just some of the considerations that might factor into a decision to continue to allow migrants and refugees to live here. As one individual told me, and I think this sort of sums it up well, the Egyptian state wants to do as little as possible. It knows they're there, of course, but it doesn't want to expend the effort to do anything with them, so it kind of turns a blind eye. And I would argue that in Morocco, at least during this period, we see a somewhat similar response. So in Morocco's case, Morocco was often sort of the penultimate stop on the route, the Western Mediterranean route, up through Morocco towards Spain. But increasingly, as a result of the EU's policies, this became difficult to fulfill that migratory route throughout the 1990s and increasingly into the 2000s. And as a result, kind of cities across Morocco began to sort of see migrants in particular staying for longer periods of time. So here's a quote from an NGO director in Oujda, which is a city closest to the border with Algeria, where many migrants first arrived to in Morocco. He says, in the early 2000s, Media was easier to access, and migrants coming from Algeria would just pass through here. But afterward, it became difficult to cross, and migrants had to stay in Oujda longer. So we started to see problems of homelessness and health. And there weren't any organizations for migrants in Oujda then. We were the first. So organizations saw this need and started to sort of step in and fill this gap in terms of what wasn't being provided directly by the Moroccan government. And that's not just true in Oujda, this is throughout Morocco in cities like Rabat and Tangier and Casablanca. The UNHCR was in charge of all the refugee activities at the time, and then again, NGOs sort of became these primary service providers. One important difference, though, was that there was more violence occurring in Morocco in comparison to Egypt. So there was sort of more active policing, especially if migrants got close to those northern, Spanish enclaves on the northern coast of Morocco. Sometimes migrant camps would be sort of raised, and then migrants would be arrested and sometimes forcibly deported across the border into Algeria, or this no man's land separating Algeria and Morocco. And Turkey, I argue, looks somewhat similar at this time of period as well. So Turkey did receive some important refugee arrivals in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. But even then, refugee matters were basically primarily managed by the UNHCR, and then domestic NGOs sort of stepped in to fill this protection gap. So as the director of one prominent NGO in Istanbul explains, refugees were arriving in Turkey at this time. They had zero access to any kind of legal information, counseling, and assistance, and a lot of them actually didn't know where to go, how to apply. A lot of times they were having problems with the UNHCR procedure. So there's not a lot of information, there's not a lot of direct coordination, or certainly not a lot of direct service provision coming from the Turkish government, but these NGOs and INGOs are permitted to operate in Turkey and provide services sort of on the government's behalf. There's also limited policing of irregular migration. So even though Turkey has quite a liberal visa policy, so individuals can come legally, and then maybe they overstay their visas, maybe they eventually hope to pass on to Europe. Some just hope to participate in the informal economy. But Turkey wasn't sort of really cracking down on this known problem of sort of a large irregular migrant presence at the time. So what is the other component of this de facto integration? I'll just give some examples to explain what I mean. These are two, I'm going to pull up two quotes now from the Egyptian example, which is that people are able to find this informal work, again, in the informal economy. So as an example of sort of two sectors, this refugee from Congo explains, a lot of refugees find work in households as maids, some men even. But mostly for men, finding work is hard. And if they find work, it's maybe in one of the factories. So those are sort of just two sectors in which people might be able to find employment. Of course, if you're working informally, it can lead to things like exploitation. So as an example, one individual from Sudan told me, for 1 month I worked at a factory in Cairo. The Egyptians in the same job would make 150 pounds a day. But the Sudanese would make 70 or 50 for the same job, and working from 8 in the morning until 8 at night, so 12 hours. So for the month, I'd make 1,200 Egyptian pounds. But apartments are expensive, and gas is expensive, and the salary isn't enough. And in both Morocco and Turkey, there are similar examples of how migrants and refugees are able to find informal employment, and how this is sort of well known and acknowledged by the state, but not necessarily intervened with. So the picture on the left is a photo I took in a neighborhood called Takadoum in Rabat, which is known as sort of a migrant hub where a lot of people choose to live there because other migrants are also residing there. And in Takadoum, you'll see sort of one main thoroughfare passing through where migrants will line up in the morning looking for a day's work, and people, owners of companies in the construction sector or the, various other industries will pick up migrants for 1 day of work and then choose new people the next day. So again, you see this sort of tendency towards these exploitative behaviors. The picture on the right is from Aksarayé, which is a neighborhood in Istanbul, sort of just past the very touristy neighborhood of Sultanahmet. And if you go there, it feels very diverse, very multicultural, and it's sort of a known area where you can go to maybe try and sell your wares on the street, as is shown here, or where you might be able to easily find informal employment, and also potentially where you might be able to find a smuggler to try and reach Europe. So now I'm going to switch and start talking about these transitions that you see. And I won't focus on the Egyptian case just because that goes the other direction towards a more, at least for a period of time, towards a more exclusionary policy. But in Morocco and Turkey, there are interestingly similar mechanisms at play that lead to the implementation, at least as sort of a framework of these liberal policies. So I'll focus first on Morocco. So in 2013, Morocco underwent this massive migration policy overhaul. In September 2013, King Mohammed VI announced that Morocco would be reforming its national migration policy. And an important component of this was a regularization campaign for migrants who were residing in Morocco. They had to meet one of 6 criteria. The most important, or the most prominently used criteria, was that you had to be able to document that you had been residing in the country for 5 years prior to this date, which was actually somewhat difficult to do if you've been residing there informally, right? But people, they ended up ultimately regularizing over 25,000 individuals, so people were able to find ways. The government also chose to take on responsibility for refugees from the UNHCR. So previously the UNHCR had been responsible for all refugee activities and protection, and this was something the government agreed to take on. I didn't write it up here, but there were also 3 new laws that were agreed to be developed on trafficking, on migration in general, and on asylum, domestic asylum. And then there's sort of an informal change to its policing policy. So at least during that year when the regularization campaign was happening, there was a noticeable decrease in the policing of irregular migrants in Morocco. So it was met with quite a lot of fanfare, certainly domestically, but also internationally. Morocco loved to talk about this policy change. And its official narrative was that this was the government, responding to this civil society-driven process. So there had been a lot of advocacy that was done in the years leading up to the policy change on behalf of rights groups in Morocco and also migrant organizations themselves. So the government was saying that we were just responding to these demands. Here's a quote from a spokesperson from the Ministry of Migration Affairs who says, "There has never been a public policy like this in Morocco, executed with such a high level of coordination with civil society. We do nothing without coordination with civil society." So this seems to fit this sort of traditional, from the academic literature, this seems to fit this explanation that's this sort of neo-institutionalist explanation. So historically, in Europe and in North America, migrants conducted advocacy. They partnered with different rights groups. They partnered with trade unions. The judiciary assisted them by supporting their claims. And eventually there were liberalizations to the policies, migration policies, but also citizenship policies of countries across Europe, as well as in the United States. So it seems like maybe something similar is at play in Morocco. Between 2005 and 2013, we saw a number of protests conducted annually and even more frequently than that between migrant organizations themselves partnering with domestic civil society groups. But this had been going on, again, since 2005. So why did the reform suddenly happen in 2013? It doesn't quite explain the timing of the reform. So rather than just this civil society-driven explanation, I argue that there are sort of 2 alternative explanations. So one has to do with international shaming, and the other has to do with diplomatic incentives. So the first, this is a little bit of an important timeline at play, but basically, so the reform occurred in September 2013, and earlier that year, an important migrant protection group, rights group called GADAM, as well as several other sort of NGOs in Morocco and community-based migrant organizations, had gotten together and written this lengthy report that documented the abuses of migrants by the Moroccan government. And they took this lengthy report and they delivered commentary based on the report in Geneva. And this is at the 19th session of the International Monitoring Committee of the International Convention on the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Their Families, which Morocco had signed on to previously, and it was due to sort of give a report about what it had done to protect migrant workers and their families. So knowing the timing of this, GADAM and the other NGOs traveled to Geneva and presented their report, basically shaming the Moroccan government. Sort of simultaneously, or just a month prior, the National Council for Human Rights, which is a quasi-governmental body in Morocco, had used GADAM's report to write their own report, and they delivered it to the king as sort of a set of recommendations about how the government could improve its migration policy. So on the 10th of September, so the day after, Morocco, the government decided to adopt all of the CNDH's recommendations regarding migration policy reform. So having spoken with government officials, spoken with representatives at GADM, spoken with people at the National Council for Human Rights, there's a sort of consensus that it's not coincidental. There was this shaming tactic at play because Morocco does not like being embarrassed about its policies, its human rights records at the international level. The other thing that was going on, or really sort of two sets of things that were going on though at the same time, both relate to sort of diplomatic factors. So the first is that in June 2013, so just 2 months prior to the reform, Morocco had signed on to a mobility partnership with the European Union. And Morocco had already had a number of agreements with the EU previously. But with this mobility partnership, it sort of intensified its commitments towards the European Union. And it basically commits Morocco to eventually sign a European readmission agreement whereby migrants transiting through Morocco who arrive in Europe could then be sent back to Morocco, even if they're not Moroccan nationals. So again, this sort of commitment to Europe in terms of carrying out some of Europe's migration policy preferences. And so it was being sort of tossed around that this reform really had to do with, I'll just quote this figure from the Moroccan Association for Human Rights here, who says, the reform is really a way of appeasing European countries, which can then claim that migrants have no need to travel to Europe when integration possibilities exist in Morocco. So if the policies domestically in Morocco look better, maybe migrants won't actually need to even try to travel to Europe. So again, this sort of externalization of the EU's migration policy preferences. So that's one possible factor. The other, though, has to do with Morocco's, instead of looking north towards Europe, has to do with what Morocco is thinking about its southern neighbors in West Africa. So prior to the September 2013 reform, King Mohammed VI was kind of making the rounds in West Africa, to making different trade deals, various economic deals with leaders of West African countries. And this picture in the right is a picture of Senegalese President Macky Sall meeting with King Mohammed VI in Rabat because in July 2013, there were protests of Senegalese nationals outside the Senegalese embassy in Rabat over the issue of migration policy in Morocco, so objecting to how badly they were being treated in Morocco and raising these concerns in front of the Senegalese embassy. So the Senegalese president came to Morocco to sort of mitigate this, and one can imagine that maybe part of that conversation went something like, if you want to continue to develop these trade deals and these diplomatic relations with us, maybe you need to treat our migrants, our nationals better who are residing in your country. So this is another factor, Morocco's increasing interest in West African countries, its relations with West African countries. Okay, so now I'll talk about Turkey. Can I ask how I'm doing on time?
Yeah, like 15 minutes.
Okay. So Turkey also goes through a reform process in 2013. So in April 2013, Turkey adopts a new law covering foreigners and international protection, so sort of all migration issues as well as asylum in Turkey. And one important thing that this new law did was it created the Directorate General for Migration Management, which is a civil body, still within the Ministry of the Interior, but a migration sort of specific body, whereas previously the issue of migration and asylum was handled basically by the police. So this was getting also a lot of fanfare in Turkey. One UNHCR representative, actually a number really said sort of the same thing, but this one here quotes, I'll quote, the head of the UNHCR Istanbul office is describing the new law's implementation as Turkey shifting to a more rights-based approach, whereas previously migration and asylum had been viewed through sort of a narrow security lens. So this 2013 reform, many sort of attribute to, well, it's about the influence of the EU accession process. So Turkey wanting to eventually join the European Union. And in 1999, Turkey was recognized as a candidate country to begin the accession process. In 2001, Turkey and the EU adopted an accession partnership, whereby there was sort of a roadmap drawn out, and Turkey would have to reform a number of its domestic institutions in order to be considered as a candidate country, in order to meet the Schengen criteria, the Copenhagen criteria, and join Schengen. And migration was one of those policy areas. However, in 2006, the negotiations with the EU basically fell apart and were shelved indefinitely. And yet, Turkey continued on with reforming the issue of migration specifically. So in 2008, the Ministry of the Interior conducted this needs assessment, or appointed 2 inspectors to conduct a needs assessment to determine what exactly was needed in terms of making a new law about migration and asylum. So again, there's these sort of 2 sets of factors at play. So one, it has to do with diplomacy and Turkey's geostrategic position. So to quote here, this is one particular quote, but a number of people sort of spoke to the same phenomenon. So this is the director of an NGO in Istanbul who says, well, it was really that a certain clique, a team of bureaucrats from the Asylum and Migration Bureau of the Turkish Ministry of the Interior and a small group within the Turkish ministry in charge of EU negotiations, they came to understand the significance of migration and asylum in a regional sense. So it went beyond just the confines of the EU accession process, and it was really about Turkey understanding how important their geographic and political position was on this issue of migration in regards to the EU, but also in regards to sending countries. Another alternative explanation, though, has to do with international shaming. So first of all, around the same time that the Ministry of the Interior appointed these 2 inspectors, there were a number of very critical NGO reports that were made public domestically, but also promoted internationally, that again tried to shame Turkey about what it had been doing in terms of deportations and the situation, especially in detention centers. Also importantly, there were a number of cases brought against Turkey at the European Court of Human Rights, which Turkey is a party to. And in particular, there was a 2009 case of 2 Iranian asylum seekers who were deported from Turkey. They denied their claims and deported them from Turkey. The individuals came back to Turkey because they felt unsafe in Iran and at time tried to appeal this decision. So with the assistance of lawyers and some rights groups, they took their claims instead to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights ruled in the favor of Turkey at this point. And then there were a number of cases following that as well that where Turkey was found to have, was convicted basically. So again, this sort of international shaming at a time when Turkey is still looking, even though the accession process has fallen apart, is still looking towards Europe as an important diplomatic partner. Okay, even though these sort of liberal frameworks came into place in 2013 in both countries, or at least the process was instigated in 2013, there's still this sort of resilience at the implementation level of indifference. So in Morocco, for example, this is quoting an NGO director in Oujda, he says, "The ministry likes to talk a lot, but it doesn't take integration seriously. If it did, it would have started offering integration right away, not a year after it issued residency permits. By now, most people's residency cards have expired, so migrants have to go to the offices and renew them. And you know what they want? They want proof of a life." So what he's saying is that if Morocco had been serious about really integrating migrants into the national system, it would have made sure to accompany these changes in this regularization campaign with sensitization measures and real attempts at integration, because people would get these 1-year permits through this regularization process, but then in order to renew the permit, they had to have things like a formal employment contract or a housing contract or something to show that they're really living in Morocco. And those things are hard to get if people aren't necessarily willing to formally employ you or formally house you. In Turkey, even with this policy in place, it was still the case that most people, and it still is the case, that most people are working informally. So just as an example, the head of the office, UNHCR office in Gaziantep in southeast Turkey, explains, lots of people are working informally. I may go get my car washed and it's a Syrian working there. Or at the place I get my shirts cleaned. Or I go to eat and there's Syrians working in the restaurant. They're working everywhere, but they're all working without benefits and without insurance. And even after, we can talk more in the Q&A about 2016 and the EU-Turkey deal, but even after there were attempts to integrate Syrians more formally, Syrians specifically, into the formal economy, it didn't really work out because there were issues with employers having to still sort of exercise a lot of effort in order to formally hire Syrians. So it was still the case, whether Syrians or otherwise, most people are continuing to work informally. And one thing I talk about in a specific paper I've written on this topic of sort of policy liberalization in Morocco and Turkey, is that perhaps this pathway to reform, so if countries reform a policy, not because of sort of this human rights driven process that we saw historically in Europe or in the US, if they instead reform their migration policies because of diplomatic incentives, primarily driving them, maybe there's not as much of an incentive to really follow through on implementation of the reforms. And it also means that there might be a greater potential for sort of backlash of these policies. So just as two examples from this post-2015 period, when we've seen an increased cooperation between Europe and a lot of its neighboring countries or countries of the southern Mediterranean. In Morocco, for example, in October, so about a year ago, Morocco and Spain began sort of intensifying their cooperation on migration. Morocco claimed that because of the situation in Libya, many migrants were instead trying to go through Morocco again in order to reach Spain. So Spain and Morocco intensified their cooperation on migration, and then subsequently Morocco instigated this harsh crackdown on sub-Saharan African migrants, arresting and detaining and even deporting individuals again. And then just recently this year, probably partly as a result of the Turkish economy and of the AKP party not doing well in the Istanbul rerun of the mayoral election, the AKP party and Erdogan have been under a lot of pressure on these issues and have sort of used Syrian refugees as a scapegoat. So this summer and just last month, we saw increased numbers of roundups of Syrian individuals in particular, and sometimes deportation of Syrian refugees to northern Syria. And this potentially, or it's speculated that this has to do with Erdogan's plan to establish this safe zone in northern Syria as sort of a buffer against what he feels is a threat from Kurdish areas. So I'm just going to talk really quickly about sort of what consequences of indifference in particular means for migrants and refugees. And I won't do this section justice, but we can talk more in the Q&A. So I'm interested in how indifference can maybe be viewed both positively and negatively. So one thing is that it does allow for sort of flexibility and the opportunity to exist in relative anonymity in host states. So as an example, an individual from Mali working in Rabat and operating a small restaurant says, well, the government doesn't provide any funds, but it doesn't give me trouble either. It just kind of looks away. An individual in Syria, from Syria residing in Gaziantep says, you know, in regards to the government, they don't ask you, why do you work here? And this is the same as Turkish people. This is very good. This is freedom. So in some sense, it can be viewed sort of positively. This ability, this hands-off, indirect approach from the government means that people can reside and actually participate, albeit informally, in their host country. But of course, it also leaves migrants and refugees in a very precarious position, especially if the political situation changes and they find themselves sort of being targeted. So I'll just revisit some of the arguments from the beginning, and then I'll talk about sort of where this fits in a broader picture. So the first thing is that, what I hope I've argued, is that indifference allows us to see sort of cross-national variation. So it allows us to understand all the different types of policies that might be at play, rather than just sort of a repressive policy and a liberal policy. There is maybe this in-between space that I argue is still a policy. And it allows us to understand that there's more variation going on than may have been previously thought. And then I've argued that states are willing to deploy resources for the purpose of engaging via a more high output strategy. I talked about liberal policies, but I think this is also true if a state wants to implement a more repressive policy, if the economic and diplomatic incentives to do so are in place. So again, it's not entirely about state capacity. It also has to do with being a strategic actor. And then lastly, I, again, didn't really talk about this, but the option of indifference does allow migrants and refugees the ability to engage in informal work, but it can leave them in a precarious position. And so I'll just put this in sort of a larger context. So I was thinking about, in regards to this project, at the same time that the text was being drafted for the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. So this was June 2018, and then it was signed formally in December of last year. So at the same time the text was being finalized at this conference in Morocco, there was simultaneously this, as you can see in the picture on the right, there was a European Union Leaders Summit that was happening in Brussels. So at the summit in Brussels, European countries couldn't agree on any kind of internal mechanism for, quote unquote, burden sharing of hosting or accepting refugees amongst each other, amongst the European Union member states. But what they did agree on was that they need to further externalize the migration policies. So this is when they started talking about hosting or building these disembarkation platforms in countries across North Africa. And they received some pushback for this, but it's still the idea, the premise of we won't deal with this internally, we'll force these other countries to comply with our needs on migration by hosting refugees and migrants sort of indefinitely. So this was happening at the same time that the text for these for the Global Compact was being developed, which at least in its premise is supposed to offer more legal pathways for regular migration, right? And so what I want to do partly with this project is sort of help reconceptualize Global South host states as not just the recipients of the policy preferences of European countries or more powerful Western countries, but also as sort of strategic actors in their own right, who choose a policy based on their own both domestic and international incentives. So again, we need to view these states as strategic actors with their own interests and give them sort of more of a meaningful seat at the table. So I'll stop there, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. So for questions, we'll take about 3 at a time, not to overwhelm Kelsey. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and Abdullah will come to you. I don't think the microphone is on.
I have some questions. No? Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Bagat. I'm an Egyptian journalist. I completely appreciate your work. I have some notes or some questions. You have chosen a very terrible era in our history here in Egypt, to 2013 and 2015. It's completely terrible era and terrible history. You can say there was no NGOs here in Egypt in this era. It was terrible policy, also terrible for the state. But I have these questions. I wanted to know the number of migrants and refugees in these 3 countries in this era. You didn't mention how can we avoid this phenomena. I don't know if you have to ask these people in the case studies about how to avoid this phenomena of refugees or migration. I think it was better to choose also Jordan. I think Jordan is a very huge host country in the region. Zatari camp, it's a very famous one. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Spotlight. Thank you both for your questions. In terms of the numbers, I can't remember if I had a slide here. No, I'm sorry. Sometimes I have a slide here with some of the more recent like UNHCR numbers. But it's an interesting question, numbers, because it's quite difficult. So you have the numbers of individuals registered with the UNHCR, right? So these are individuals that have approached UNHCR, asked to be registered, and then undergo a refugee status determination process. So that includes sort of asylum seekers and refugees. So at this time, let's see, when I was interviewing in 2014, there were officially 250,000 Syrians registered with UNHCR, but when I spoke with individuals in the Egyptian government, they were estimating that there were probably 100,000 to 150,000 Syrians that were not registered. And then that doesn't include, of course, individuals from Sudan and South Sudan and Ethiopia and Eritrea. So I could look these numbers up, but I won't also remember back to 2014. But I'm happy to send you them if you want to look later. But okay, beyond numbers, your second question, can you remind me?
How to avoid this phenomenon?
So do you mean how to not permit migrants and refugees from
the people you have made in this case study? Did you ask them how to avoid this phenomena? How to avoid the phenomena of migration and the refugees?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because in particular, this is not entirely new. It really comes from an earlier period in the 1990s, but especially following sort of Europe's migration crisis in 2015, there's been an increased emphasis on development as sort of a substitute for migration, right? So not necessarily refugees, because they might be leaving their homes for different reasons, but for migration, this thinking behind some of the more recent migration deals, like the EU Trust Fund for Africa, is that if we can sort of build the capacity and provide more opportunities for migrants in their home countries, they won't migrate. And there's been a lot of money that's come through that sort of mentality, sent to countries, including Egypt, actually. But one difficulty with that, from academic research at least, is that there's actually studies that show that in the short to medium term, more individuals will leave their home countries if the GDP and other sort of economic indicators increase, because it increases individuals' desire and knowledge about migration opportunities, and then they see the ability to actually do that. So only in the long term, once the GDP has sort of reached a level that is on par with countries they might want to try and go to, would individuals maybe not choose to migrate. So there's some problematic assumptions, I think, behind a lot of the policies that are now being implemented with that sort of question in mind. So how do we keep people from migrating? I think there should be more legal pathways for migration. I think there's a lot of sort of win-win aspects to that. And maybe that will come to fruition under this global compact and under some of the programs that are being developed now, but I think it's maybe too soon to say. You asked about Jordan too.
Yeah.
So this is a good question. Case selection is always very important. In my larger project, I talk about sort of, if we think about sort of the broad Middle East, North Africa region, I realize I'm including Turkey in that, and that has, people question that as well. But if we think about sort of broadly defined as southeastern Mediterranean region, I didn't include Jordan or Lebanon or Syria. I mean, Syria wouldn't have been feasible anyway, because I didn't want to look at host states that had this previous very strong presence of refugee hosting. So Lebanon and Jordan have hosted Palestinians, as well as other groups, for decades. So I think that affects the way a state thinks about hosting migration, hosting migrants and refugees in the more present tense. So I wanted to look, and granted, I know Egypt had also received Palestinians, but it wasn't in sort of a camp-like situation as it was in Jordan and in Lebanon. So this was my logic in terms of thinking. I call these countries, it's not entirely accurate, but I call them sort of transit-term host countries in terms of looking at what the effect of EU policy has been over the past 3 decades on these countries. And the gentleman in the back asked about Egypt. It was just sort of a choice in terms of time, but I have written articles about Egypt, so if you would like to know more about my research on that, I'm happy to talk more about it. Oh, and sorry, another comment you made earlier was that it is, looking at that particular time is difficult. So 2013, 2014, yeah. It was a very difficult time in Egypt, I know. And there were certain refugee groups that also had a really difficult time as well. So part of my trip here actually is that I'm speaking with some government officials and with different international migration actors and NGOs to get a sense to update this research, because 2014 was a particular year, I understand. Thank you.
Any further questions?
Thank you very much. My name is Aida Yahya. I'm an assistant lecturer at the British University in Egypt. I wanted to ask you with regards to your project. The time frame is just focused on 2013 until 2015, right?
In terms of this presentation, but in the sort of book project, I look at updating not just these 3 countries, but sort of what happened in the region following the European quote-unquote refugee crisis. So trying to understand how some of the migration agreements that have come out of that time period have also impacted those countries. So there's a update the research, but most of it, as I said, was done during that earlier period.
Okay, because my question was with regards to Egypt's shifts and its attitude towards having it more like an exclusion one. And this exclusion is it exclusion against all migrants and refugees due to security concerns, or is it only focused with the Syrians because of what was going on and because of having the new administration in control and so on and so forth?
Right.
Thank you.
Good question. In the book I talk mostly, I mean, I think it really began with the focus on Syrians during that particular time period. But I do think that at least in 2014, it was sort of, migration was sort of being thought about beyond just Syrians, as there are links between migration and things like trafficking and smuggling and maybe even terrorism. So I think there was this more security-oriented approach to migration for a time period that has been moved away from now. So I think it was again this sort of punctuated period that began with Syrian refugees, but that sort of grew to migration as a topic more wholly. And I think that there was also, if I recall, a situation with Ethiopians during the time because of sort of tense negotiations about the dam situation. So for a while, Ethiopians were also having a more difficult time in Egypt. So I think this was a difficult time period for more than just Syrians. But again, this has, from what I understand, and many of you in this room can probably correct me, this is basically blown over, and now we've sort of returned to maybe what was previously in place in terms of indifference.
A little bit on this whole question of Egypt, the move from indifference to repression. Because what I'm seeing here, and is partly some crackdowns, but partly indifference and ability of refugees and migrants to continue to stay. And there may be insecurities that enshroud that stay here. You work in the informal sector, you're waiting, you don't know whether you can get to another country, you're not allowed to work if you're given the blue card, so there are those issues. So how would you, categorize that kind of policy when you see this on the ground? And what's the shift, the causes for that shift? You often refer to, and this is a comment, you often refer to the migration crisis, but I think it's more a crisis of governance rather than a migration crisis for reasons that we understand. And thirdly, when you're talking about the so-called liberal shift, and you've talked about alternative 1 and alternative 2, I think it's a mix of all those factors, and it's not an alternative explanation. They're a mix of all those things. For instance, we are talking about the EU partnership with Turkey. I mean, there's a heavy economic investment in Turkey to make those reforms, to keep Syrian migrants there, to integrate them into the economy, to have better reception facilities, host country and migrant cohesion, all of those kinds of things. If you're talking about Niger also, there's a lot of development assistance, or maybe not development assistance, but economic aid being given and economic transactions to Niger to crack down on smugglers. What is it doing to the economy of Agadez and all those places? So if you can speak to that a little bit, because I didn't hear you talking about the whole economic dimension between Europe and these countries, the so-called hotspot countries and their externalization policies.
Okay. I think I'm going to lose track of the questions, but I'll do my best to keep your mind if I'm not addressing them. So you're absolutely right, though, about the European. I think I don't know which terminology to use anymore, because I want to refer to this time period when there was this heightened focus on arrivals of individuals, migrants or refugees or asylum seekers in Europe. I agree with you, though, that it was really a crisis of governance, not of actual numbers. I 100% agree. In terms of the economic aspects of these migration agreements and their impact domestically, this is, I mean, it's certainly not a completely new phenomenon. This has been going on for decades, right? And I think that various states have sort of understood this as a way to capitalize on this source of funding without necessarily transferring into better policies for migrants or refugees on the ground. And I think we see this, I mean, you're speaking about Nigeria, but right, globally, not globally, but at least within this sort of broad neighborhood, I think that's the case across the board. And certainly in Turkey and in Jordan, where there was a heavy investment economically in terms of trying to find pathways to regular migration for Syrians in particular. In neither case did it, greatly benefit Syrian refugees. And most, as I said, most people are continuing to work in informal economy because these deals, which were not developed very well in coordination with local actors who might have understood how this would work, in neither case did it really match what the needs were on the ground. So in Turkey, the onus was really on employers to have to do quite a bit of legwork and to provide full employment benefits and health insurance, et cetera, for Syrians, and they're not necessarily willing to do that when they could hire someone informally for so much less money. In Jordan, there were these special economic zones set up, I'm sure you know, where Syrians were supposed to be able to find formal employment, and then companies operating in those zones would have preferential market access to the European Union, but there was a mismatch between what sort of environment Syrians actually wanted to work in and to have to travel so far to get to those zones. And they were also displacing Egyptian workers, for example, as well as other nationalities who had worked in those industries previously. So there was a huge mismatch in terms of these policies developed with a top-down approach that didn't really benefit migrants or refugees, I should say, on the ground. Can I ask you to tell me if there's other aspects of the sort of economic dimensions of migration agreement that you were hoping that I would speak to? Okay.
The Egypt dimension is something I want to hear about.
The Egypt dimension?
Yeah. Well, what I'm seeing now is not necessarily regression. I would see it as indifference.
Yes, I agree.
But you looked at it as indifference to repression in Egypt.
Sorry, in that sort of punctuated period of 2013 to 2014. There was, when I say this, what I'm really talking about is sort of increased expenditures being used towards doing things like arrests or detention or deportations. That is fairly well documented. But there was a movement away from that, I would say, and not an emphasis on the security aspect of the presence of migrants and refugees. And that would move it back closer, I think, towards indifference. And I think what's interesting in Egypt, and what I'm hoping to find out more about, is this increased sort of interest in Egypt as a partner in managing migration from the EU in this post-2015 space, including a 2017 agreement and Egypt receiving funds under the EU Trust Fund for Africa that I think will have interesting impacts here in Egypt, and this is something I'm hoping to find out more about.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Elsie.
Feel free to email me if you would like other. Yeah.
One more question.
Okay.
Because you've dealt with North Africa, and so, I'm sure if you're a migration scholar, you would be looking at other parts of Africa. I'm trying to grapple with the fact, or trying to understand why in Africa, migration hasn't, quote unquote, hit the headlines, so to speak. When you talk about the Middle East, everyone's talking about migrants coming here and, a lot of country bashing and shaming and all that kind of thing. If you're talking about East and Southeast Asia, there's that dynamic there, and there's a lot of talk about migration, public space, public discourse. But within Africa itself, what do you think are the reasons as to why it hasn't become a big issue? It's an issue when they go to Europe, and that's understandable. But within Africa?
Well, if we're talking about it from the Europeans' point of view, I think Europe is very limited in how they think about priorities, right? So a colleague of mine.
Well, I'm talking about within Africa.
No, so let me just, I'll come to it. So a colleague of mine did an interesting study of the funding that came out of the EU Trust Fund for Africa, looking at which countries receive sort of greater amounts. And one of the factors he was interested in was geographic. So do they give preference to countries that are sort of closer to its periphery because they see those as sort of, if migrants can get to these countries in North Africa, there's a greater likelihood they'll cross the sea and get to Europe. So they give preference to sort of countries of its periphery because they see that as setting up this barrier to be able to prevent migration to EU borders. So I think that's part of the focus, is that the EU, if we're thinking about an EU mentality, it thinks about the countries closest to it as being sort of priority countries for that reason. That said, I think that within Africa, there are all sorts of interesting discussions about internal, more liberal migration regimes the African Union passport. I think there's all sorts of interesting, again, like South-South questions that are going on that just don't receive the same kind of attention from Europe because it's so focused on its own sort of security priorities. And I think, I know Alina maybe can speak to a conference that the CMRS is going to have on South-South migration. So I think countries of the Global South are interested in setting up more dialogues on the topic of migration and maybe more facilitation because actually most migration happens regionally, right? It doesn't happen internationally, from one region to another. So there is a lot of migration, there is a great deal of migration happening in various regions that doesn't sort of get the same sort of attention from Western media that it may deserve because of the numbers out there.
Any further questions? Well, thank you, Dr. Kelsey, for the inspiring lecture and very eye-opening. As Kelsey mentioned, October is a very busy month for CMRS. So on October 24th, we will be having a public event in Hill House starting at 6 p.m. We are holding a workshop on South-to-South migration. So we will have scholars joining us from Costa Rica, Turkey, Brazil, India, and Uganda, and Ghana. And they all do research on different migratory routes within the Global South. So we would love to see you there for what is sure to be an eye-opening discussion. And then on that Sunday, October 27th, we have a film screening. One of our scholars who is coming from Costa Rica will be screening his documentary on unaccompanied refugee children, and it will be followed by a discussion with him. And then our next CMRS seminar is on Wednesday, October 30th with Mai Gemaldine, and she will be talking about the challenges of the education system in Egypt as a destination country for migration. All of these are obviously free and open to the public. We will be emailing you as the time approaches, so if you have not signed up outside, please do so. Put your email address on, we'll put you on our mailing list, and we hope to see you at further events. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.